Ever notice how anytime someone yells market failure, the go-to solution always seems to be more government? Well, today we're diving deep into whether that's always the right move.
Yeah, it's tempting to think the government can just wave a magic wand and fix everything. But by digging into this 2019 Cato Institute analysis by Ryan Bourne, we'll see how this idea of market failure gets, well, maybe a little misapplied sometimes.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What's the difference between how economists view market failure versus how it gets used in like policy debates and stuff?
Well, economists tend to have a pretty specific definition. They often focus on things like public goods.
Public goods, right.
In theory, these are things everyone benefits from, but no one really wants to pay for individually.
Right.
Like, think about national defense. Tough to charge each person for their share of protection, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
It's tricky.
But, our source points out that a lot of things get slapped with that public good label even when they don't really fit the strict definition. So what are some examples of that?
Okay, well, let's take museums, for example. The paper actually uses the Mona Lisa.
Oh.
As in, you can't just have unlimited people crowding around the Mona Lisa at the same time, right?
Right.
There's rivalry for space, for that viewing experience. It's not like...
Totally, yeah. I've been to the Louvre, and that queue was insane to even get close to it.
Exactly.
And, come to think of it, adding more kids to a classroom doesn't magically give every student the same quality of education.
Right.
Resources are limited even if they're coming from the government.
That's a great point, and that leads us to something really interesting. Even true public goods can sometimes be provided by markets.
Oh, really?
And the historical example here is kind of fascinating. Lighthouses.
Lighthouses, seriously?
Yeah, right.
Never would have thought of that.
So back in the 18th, 19th centuries, in Britain specifically, private individuals, businesses, they built and ran lighthouses.
Huh.
And they funded this through fees from ships. So it might be like based on voyages or annual charges.
Okay, but how does that work if it's supposed to be non-excludable? Like, can't ships just use the lighthouse without paying?
You're right to point that out because later research actually found that the government wasn't totally absent from the whole lighthouse game.
Okay.
They were granting some monopolies, which let those lighthouse owners actually charge those fees and sometimes even made those fees mandatory.
Oh, interesting.
So it's more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
Okay, so not a perfect example, but it does make you think twice about whether only the government can handle certain things. Which brings us to another big one where that market failure flag gets waved around.
Yeah.
Externalities.
Right, exactly. When what you do affects other people, but those costs, or even benefits sometimes, they aren't reflected in the initial price.
Right.
Pollution, that's like the classic example. You've got a factory polluting a river, harms people downstream, but they're not paying that cost directly.
So what's the solution then? Does the government always need to step in and say, start taxing that pollution?
Well, taxes or subsidies, those are kind of the textbook solutions. The idea is to try to make those external costs like someone's actual problem.
Right.
But it's almost never that straightforward in reality.
Right.
Let's take alcohol. There are external costs for sure.
Yeah.
You've got drunk driving, you've got the healthcare burden on taxpayers, things like that.
Yeah, but isn't there a point where individual choice comes into play? Like the source talked about lost productivity from drinking, for instance.
Absolutely, and that's a key point. While excessive drinking obviously has those societal costs we talked about, someone who has a couple of drinks and is maybe a little less sharp at work the next day,
Right.
that cost is mainly on them. Lower productivity often means lower pay, maybe missed opportunities. It's hitting their own economic well-being, not necessarily some uninvolved third party.
So are we saying that, we should tax watching late night TV because it might make you tired the next day? Where do you even draw the line with this stuff?
I think that's exactly the right question to be asking. Because if every single decision that could potentially impact productivity becomes this externality that needs fixing,
Right.
we end up in a world where the government is taxing or subsidizing everything based on some theoretical idea of perfect output, not exactly realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads us to another way this market failure idea gets used, justifying taxes.
Okay.
Especially these broad, like, uniform taxes we see.
Right, like a soda tax. Everyone pays the same amount, whether they have like one a month or they're downing liters every day.
It's a perfect example because the thing is, even if something does have these external costs, those uniform taxes only really work if every single person's consumption is creating the same level of that problem.
Right.
Our source uses that soda tax to show how someone sipping one occasionally is treated exactly the same as someone whose soda habit might actually be adding strain on, say, the healthcare system.
So it's almost more about finding a simple solution than it is about actually, like, targeting the real root issue.
Yeah, often that's exactly what's going on. And this all ties into this concept of heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity.
It's a fancy way of saying people respond to incentives differently. Like, let's go back to alcohol for a sec. A heavy drinker, they might not even be fazed by a price hike.
Right.
But someone who just enjoys, a glass of wine with dinner a couple times a week, they're way more likely to maybe cut back because of that added cost.
Well, you could be disproportionately impacting the people who aren't even the main source of the problem you're trying to fix in the first place.
Exactly. It's like you're punishing everyone equally for something that not everyone is doing equally.
Right.
And that can lead to some, questionable outcomes. And this brings us to the always fun topic of bans.
Bans, yeah. Talk about like a sledgehammer approach to a problem. Is the source saying just because something has externalities, it should automatically be banned outright?
No, not at all. They use the example of plastic bag bans.
Okay.
On the surface, seems like a good idea, right?
Right. Less plastic.
Reduce waste, protect the oceans, all that. But what so often gets overlooked is what people end up using instead of those banned bags.
Oh, interesting. So you're not actually eliminating the impact, you're just shifting it somewhere else.
Potentially, yeah.
So what, like everyone just switches to paper bags?
A lot of times, yeah. And here's the kicker. The data actually suggests that paper bags can sometimes be worse for the environment overall.
Oh, wow.
They take more energy and water to produce. They create more landfill waste. They can even lead to higher greenhouse gas emissions in some cases.
See, that's the thing. I always feel so guilty using those like flimsy plastic bags at the grocery store.
Right.
Thinking, oh, I'll take the paper. I'm being like the eco-conscious person.
Yeah, and it just goes to show the importance of looking at that entire life cycle of a product.
Right.
And considering like the full range of impacts. Now, the source isn't saying plastic bags are good for the environment.
Right.
But it's more that a ban without thinking about those alternatives might not be the simple solution, it seems.
So are there any other like downsides to these types of bans that we haven't even touched on?
Well, they often assume that zero consumption of whatever it is always the goal.
Right.
But they can overlook the needs of certain groups who genuinely rely on those products. Take plastic straws, for instance.
Oh, right. I've read about this.
Yeah.
For folks with certain disabilities, those flexible plastic straws are like essential. They need them to drink.
Yeah.
And these bans can make it incredibly difficult to do something as simple as go out for a meal or like grab a drink with friends.
Exactly. It goes back to that heterogeneity idea, right?
Right.
What might seem like a minor inconvenience to one person could be this major barrier for someone else. It's just a good reminder that those blanket approaches, they don't always consider that full range of human experiences and needs.
It's really easy to get caught up in those like ban everything arguments.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, sometimes there are these unintended consequences that can actually end up hitting certain groups way harder than others. It makes you wonder, like, what's the real takeaway here? When someone starts yelling market failure, should we always just assume the government can come in and fix it?
That's the big question, isn't it? Just because markets aren't perfect, which obviously they're not, doesn't necessarily mean the government always has this perfect solution just waiting in the wings.
It's like that old saying, the government that governs best governs least. But like, when do we actually know that intervention, like actually stepping in, is going to make things better and not a whole lot worse?
Well, our source really stresses this need to compare policies not against some like utopian ideal, but against what the real alternatives are.
Right.
We should be asking like, okay, what are the trade-offs here? What are the potential downsides? What might happen that we haven't even thought about? It's about understanding that governments, well, they're made up of people too, and people can get things wrong.
Right. They don't magically get everything right just because they're the government.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like learning about rent control in college. The whole idea was to make housing more affordable, right?
Right.
But then it ended up leading to housing shortages, and it actually ended up benefiting wealthier tenants who were the ones who could actually get those rent controlled apartments.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to like Actually look at the evidence. Consider those unintended consequences, not just assume that any government intervention is automatically going to be this net positive for everyone.
Right.
Sometimes the best solution might be finding ways to actually make markets work better, not just saying, well, market failure, get rid of it, government takes over.
So it's more about being like discerning, right? Not just accepting market failure as this like catch-all argument for why the government should intervene.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive. It's definitely made me rethink some of my own assumptions about, markets, government, all that stuff. It's given me a lot to ponder.
Me too.
So for everyone listening, here's a final thought to chew on as you go about your day. We've spent this episode unpacking all the ways market failure gets used to justify intervention. But what about those times when government intervention actually has worked? What are the factors that contribute to an intervention actually being successful? Something to think about. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.